This lecture is about the methods for text categorization. So in this lecture, we're going to discuss how to do text categorization. First, there are manual methods for text categorization. In such a method, the idea is to determine the category based on some rules that we design carefully to reflect the domain knowledge about the categorization problem. So for example, if you want to do topic categorization for news articles, you can say, well, if the news article mentions a word like game and sports 3 times, then we're going to say it's about sports. Things like that. And this would allow us to deterministically decide which category a document should be put into. Now, such a strategy would work well if the following conditions hold. First, the categories must be very well defined, and this allows a person to clearly decide the category based on some clear rules. Secondly, the categories have to be easily distinguished based on surface features in text. So that means superficial features like keywords or punctuations or whatever you can easily identify in text data. For example, if there is some special vocabulary that is known to only occur in a particular category, and that would be most effective because we can easily use such a vocabulary or pattern of such a vocabulary to recognize this category. Now, we also should have sufficient knowledge for designing these rules, and so if that's the case, then such a method can be effective, and so it does have applications in some domains and sometimes. However, in general, there are several problems with this approach. First, of course, it's labor intensive. It requires a lot of manual work. Obviously, we can't do this for all kinds of categorization problems. We have to do it from scratch for a different problem because different rules would be needed. So it doesn't scale up well. Secondly, it cannot handle uncertainties in rules. Often the rules aren't 100% reliable. Take, for example, looking at the occurrences of words in text and try to decide the topic. It's actually very hard to have a 100% correct rule. So, for example, you can say, well, if it has game, sports, basketball, then for sure it's about sports. But one can also imagine some text articles that mention these keywords, but that may not be exactly about sports or only marginally touching sports. The main topic could be another topic, a different topic than sports. So that's one disadvantage of this approach. And finally, the rules may be inconsistent, and this would lead to concern about robustness. More specifically, and sometimes the results of categorization may be different depending on which rule to be applied. So in that case, then you will face uncertainty, and you will also have to decide the order of applying the rules or combination of results that are contradictory. So all these are problems with this approach, and it turns out that both problems can be solved or alleviated by using machine learning. So these machine learning methods are more automatic, but I still put automatic in quotation marks because they're not really completely automatic because they still require manual work. More specifically, we have to use human experts to help in 2 ways. First, the human experts must annotate datasets with category labels. We tell the computer which documents should receive which categories. And this is called training data. And then secondly, the human experts also need to provide a set of features to represent each text object that can potentially provide a clue about the category. So we need to provide some basic features for the computers to look into. And in the case of text, a natural choice would be the words. So using each word as a feature is a very common choice to start with. But of course, there are other sophisticated features like phrases or even parse-speech tags or even syntactic structures. So once human experts can provide this, then we can use machine learning to learn soft rules for categorization from the training data. So soft rules just means we're going to still decide which category should be assigned to a document, but it's not going to be using a rule that is deterministic. So we might use something similar to saying that if it matches games, sports many times, it's likely to be a sports. But we're not going to say exactly for sure, but instead we're going to use probabilities or weights so that we can combine multiple evidences. So the learning process basically is going to figure out which features are most useful for separating different categories. And it's going to also figure out how to optimally combine features to minimize errors of categorization on the training data. So the training data, as you can see here, is very important. It's the basis for learning. And then the trained classifier can be applied to a new text object to predict the most likely category. And that's to simulate the prediction of what a human would assign to this text object if the human were to make a judgment. So when we use machine learning for text categorization, we can also talk about the problem in the general setting of supervised learning. So the setup is to learn a classifier to map a value of x into a map of y. So here x is all the text objects and y is all the categories, a set of categories. So the classifier would take any value in x as input and we generate a value in y as output. We hope the output y would be the right category for x. And here correct, of course, is judged based on the training data. So that's the general goal, like in all the machine learning problems or supervised learning problems, where you are given some examples of input and output for a function, and then the computer is going to figure out how the function behaves, like based on these examples, and then try to be able to compute the values for future x's that we have not seen. So in general, all methods would rely on discriminative features of text objects to distinguish different categories. So that's why these features are very important, and they have to be provided by humans. And they will also combine multiple features in a weighted manner with weights to be optimized to minimize the errors on the training data. So ultimately, the learning process is an optimization problem, and the objective function is often tied to the errors on the training data. Different methods tend to vary in their ways of measuring the errors on the training data. They might optimize a different objective function, which is often also called a loss function or cost function. They also tend to vary in their ways of combining the features. So a linear combination, for example, is simple, is often used, but they are not as powerful as nonlinear combination. But nonlinear models might be more complex for training, so there are trade-offs as well. But that would lead to different variations of many variations of these learning methods. So in general, we can distinguish two kinds of classifiers at a high level. One is called generative classifiers, the other is called discriminative classifiers. The generative classifiers try to learn what the data looks like in each category. So it attempts to model the joint distribution of the data and the label, X and Y. And this can then be factored out to a product of Y, the distribution of labels, and the joint probability the conditional probability of X given Y. So it's Y. So we first model the distribution of labels, and then we model how the data is generated given a particular label here. Right? And once we can estimate these models, then we can compute this conditional probability of label given data based on the probability of data given label. and the label distribution here by using the Bayes rule. Now this is the most important thing, because this conditional probability of the label can then be used directly to decide which label is most likely. So in such an approach, the objective function is actually likelihood. Right? So we model how the data are generated. So thus it only indirectly captures the training errors. But if we can model the data in each category accurately, then we can also classify accurately. One example is naive Bayes classifier in this case. The other kind of approaches are called discriminative classifiers. These classifiers try to learn what features separate categories. So they directly tackle the problem of categorization or separation of classes. So, sorry for the problem. So these discriminative classifiers attempt to model the conditional probability of the label given the data point directly. And so the objective function tends to directly measure the errors of categorization on the training data. Some examples include logistic regression, support vector machines, and the k-nearest neighbors. We will cover some of these classifiers in detail in the next few lectures.